At our table this morning, Behnam Ben Taleblu, who is a senior fellow with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Thank you very much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Greta.
We're going to talk about the G7, which begins this weekend in France. How big of a focus will Iran be for these leaders?
I think it's going to be the U.S.'s max pressure campaign, which is designed to get Iran to sit back down again for a bigger, broader, better deal, has kept both sides of the Atlantic, the transatlantic community, divided. The U.S. has pushed for a much more pressure-driven policy. The Europeans have been much more accommodationist in trying to keep this JCPOA nuclear deal, which is the 2015 Obama-era nuclear deal. And this has created some definite tension, but they have other issues to discuss as well, energy and the environment. And we all know, of course, that this used to be the G8 summit, which had Russia involved, and Russia and Iran and other rogue states will likely be on the agenda for discussion as well.
So why is it these other countries would like to stick to the nuclear agreement made under the Obama administration versus what the Trump administration would like to do? Why are they insisting that that continue?
Well, really, I think there's three key reasons, and it would be a mistake to say just one, but the biggest one that people do focus on is mercantilism or commercial relations or trade, you could basically say, where the European Union has always had an interest in trading with Iran and thinking that you could trade with Iran and that would moderate their behavior over time. I think the 1990s disproves this, where Iran was more plugged into the international economy, did sell oil, but still engaged in acts of terrorism abroad. Nonetheless, this is the first pillar. The second pillar is the security dividends these European states think that the deal provides them. They think on its face, it's good on its non-proliferation tenets, and that it's sufficient for now to deal with the Iranian nuclear challenge. And they believe that the nuclear threat is worth dealing with before you deal with the terrorism, regional missile, or other threats. And the third is actually philosophical or conceptual, that rather than confront Iran, you should engage Iran. And they say that, oh, well, the supreme leader is old, he turned 80 this summer, and that, you know, there is a chasm between state and society, which is absolutely true, even though the Europeans haven't really supported the street against the state. That's really been more a factor of U.S. policy. And they're looking to say that, you know, if Iran does change over time, we want them to be engaged when they change, as opposed to isolated when they change.
How would they respond to this? The Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, at the UN Security Council meeting on Tuesday, I want to show it for our viewers and have you come respond. He's talking about Iran's behavior in recent weeks.
Here's just a short list of what the regime has done since July. On July 1st, Iran surpassed its 300-kilogram limit on its low-enriched uranium stockpile in defiance of its nuclear commitments. On July 2nd, the Iran-backed Houthis attacked Abha Airport in Saudi Arabia, and they've continued to do so since that time. On July 8th, Iran reached levels of enrichment of about 4.5%, breaching its nuclear commitment, which capped enrichment at 3.67%. Iran continues to threaten further expansions of its nuclear program in defiance of its international commitments. On July 10th, the IRGC Navy unsuccessfully attempted to seize a UK tanker as it passed through the Strait of Hormuz. On July 14th, the IRGC Navy seized a Panamanian-flagged UAE-owned tanker in the Strait of Hormuz. On July 19th, the IRGC Navy seized a British tanker, the Sten Ampero, in the Strait of Hormuz, and Iran continues to detain that ship and its crew. On July 19th, the IRGC Navy also seized the Liberian-flagged British-owned tanker Mesdar. On July 25th, Iran test-fired a ballistic missile in defiance of UN Security Council Resolution 2231. And on another Iran-related note, we are already tracking very closely the JCPOA provisions expiring in October of 2020, namely the UN arms embargo and the travel restrictions on Qasem Soleimani. The whole world is able to track them too. We now have a countdown clock on the State Department's Iran webpage. Time is drawing short to continue this activity of restricting Iran's capacity to foment its terror regime.
Mr. Taleblu?
I think that's an impressive laundry list as to why Iran does deserve a max pressure campaign as opposed to some kind of broader engagement strategy. I think the European Union has been somewhat critical of some of those aspects there. Of course, individual members, the British, as long as they're in the EU for now, they've stood up when it comes to the freedom of navigation in the Persian Gulf and Strait of Hormuz. But collectively, I think the body is incentivized to turn a blind eye to these sources of Iranian aggression, and they habitually say that, oh, well, Iran is simply acting out in response to American sanctions. I actually would disagree with that. I think that the Iranians are publicly negotiating. They're trying to build leverage. The sanctions have been so effective in the past year. The Iranian economy really is cratering by all macroeconomic indicators. This is true. The European Union did not believe that U.S. unilateral sanctions could do in 11 years what multilateral sanctions took about a decade to do. And I think the European Union now wants to keep Iran in the deal as much as possible and therefore will not be responding to some of this aggression.
What is the maximum pressure strategy? What does it all entail?
That's an excellent question because on US-Iran policy, the term maximum pressure is really derived from the US's engagement and approach to North Korea in the era of fire and fury, really in the 2017 period. That's when the US issued tough rhetoric against North Korea, tried to create international coalition against North Korea, and levied tough sanctions and even multilateralized those sanctions at the UN. Vis-a-vis Iran, you could say that the trigger date for the max pressure campaign is May 8, 2018. That's the day the U.S. formally removed itself from the JCPOA nuclear deal and took a series of steps to put itself outside of that deal and resume to the previous 2013 policy towards Iran, which was to resurrect every single penalty, every single sanction, every single designation that was waived by the nuclear deal. And not only did President Trump restore those economic sanctions, he's added to them, enforced them. So this could be called this max pressure campaign to not just deal with the nuclear threat, but to take the same tool, U.S. coercive economic measures, economic power, political power, sanctions effectively, and apply it against Iran for a bigger, broader, better deal that is not going to be limited to the nuclear issue, but that deals with the whole reason why Iran has been international pariah for 40 years.
We're taking your questions, your comments on U.S. policy toward Iran with the G7 summit coming up this weekend. Those leaders, those 7 leaders, including the United States, expected to be talking about this issue. Republicans, 202-748-8001. Democrats, 202-748-8000. And Independents, 202-748-8002. What is life like in Iran under this maximum pressure campaign?
It's a really great question because life in Iran isn't good. Pre-max pressure, post-max pressure, during max pressure. I think the Iranian people greatly understand that, yes, there are sanctions that are squeezing their economy. Again, those macroeconomic indicators we talked about. But they are correctly ascribing the blame, not to Washington, but to their own leaders in Tehran. And really, since December 2017, not just as things heated up between the U.S. and Iran, things heated up inside Iran between the state and society. People who lived on the geographic and figurative periphery of the country began protesting. And really the December 2017 protests to present can really be likened to blue-collar protests. And these are the urban and rural poor, the downtrodden, the dispossessed, as the founding father of the Islamic Revolution, Khomeini, would like to say. And this was the generation that the revolution had put all its hopes in. And when this generation is protesting, when this generation can't be bought off by subsidies, that shows you how ideologically bankrupt the regime is. And they have to be more coercive with people they didn't have to be coercive with. They have to do more economic bribery and suasion, and they have less of that money to do this at home. So I think max pressure or no max pressure, that people understand that these restrictive measures are actually the result of Tehran's behavior. That you hear nationalist chants on the periphery of Iran that echo the nationalist chants you heard in North Tehran in 2009 during the Green Movement. The Iranian people are resilient, and they actually want the international community to do something about it.
And explain to our viewers where Iran is active outside of their country, and how is it that they can afford those activities?
That's a really great question, because Iran is a country that, if you look at its military on paper, its military, it pales in comparison to that of its U.S. or Western supplied neighbors. And this is really a familiar talking point or trope for those who don't want to do anything against Iran. Say, look, Iran doesn't spend, but Iran spends so little, but gets such a high return on its investment. An Iranian ballistic missile requires its adversaries to spend a ton more on missile defense. So Iran has a low-tech, low-cost investment, like ballistic missiles, that require its adversaries to have a high-tech, high-cost investment, like ballistic missile defense, as you're beginning to see now in Israel and Saudi Arabia. Really, since 1979, when the Islamic Revolution came around, it had this goal of exporting the revolution. And that meant it would stand with states, like the Assad regime, that were partners, and it would begin to co-opt or seek to control states that were enemies from the ground up. And this is why Iran's security strategy in the West, really west of Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Bahrain, Yemen, has been so effective and so cheap. because it's much cheaper to equip a shoeless child, a child soldier from Afghanistan, and send him to die for Iran's revolutionary cause in Syria than it is to send and train and equip a Green Beret to defend a limited American mission during the counter-ISIS campaign in Syria. So Iran gets a high bang for its buck, a high return on investment. It has an ideological interest in intervening the affairs of its neighbors, and is going to be resilient in how it's allocating its resources. And the max pressure campaign is designed to, over time, gradually limit those resources and put Tehran to the choice. Now, what we're seeing this summer is, as Iran acts out again, as Iran escalates in the Persian Gulf, as Iran escalates through its proxies in the region, Iran is trying to put America to the choice, to say, even as you restrict our revenue, we're going to try to play chicken with you and stop you from issuing these sanctions and stop you from enforcing sanctions.
Again, we're taking your calls this morning on the G7 summit and Iran's nuclear program. Republicans 202-748-8001, Democrats 202-748-8000, and Independents 202-748-8002. Our first phone call comes from John. He's a Republican in Southampton, Pennsylvania. John, your question or comment on Iran?
Yes, good morning. I have a number of comments, actually.
Okay.
And, well, to begin with, the United States is already at war with Iran. I mean, we've been at war with them. What we're doing, this so-called maximum pressure campaign that you're talking about, is at the behest of Israel, we are trying to deny them the opportunity to earn any foreign currency. So buy medicine, buy food, buy anything. I mean, can you imagine if we were forbidden from selling what our agriculture goods, our manufactured goods? The Foundation for the Protection of Democracies, the Gentleman's Organization, this is one of these organizations that pops up. They're funded. It's a local Israeli organization. It's a lobbying group. They're supposed to be a think tank, but it's a lobbying group.
Okay. Mr. Taleblu, are you familiar with what he's talking about?
Yeah, so the caller mentioned, I think, three different issues. One, the unfortunate Israel trope. That's just, I think I would say, unfortunate. The person driving the max pressure campaign is no one other than the occupant of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, Donald J. Trump himself. I think if you look at the way the Trump administration actually approached this, I think it's actually quite responsible. He was one of the few Republicans who, during the debates in 2015 and 2016, did not say that he would tear up the deal on day one. He said, I buy bad deals, I make them good deals. Then, much like the Obama administration, which engaged in lots of academic and interagency reviews, the Trump administration took about 6 to 9 months to engage in an entire Iran policy review. And on October 13, 2017, the Trump administration unveiled this policy towards Iran, which, unlike the Bush and Obama administration, which focused almost exclusively on the nuclear issue, Trump administration decided to broaden the issue set to focus on the entire breadth and depth of the Iran challenge. And then from the winter of 2017 until May of 2018, the Trump administration actually worked with the E3, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, with its transatlantic partners to try to fix the Iran deal from within. And when that process collapsed, the administration didn't issue any more waivers and began to, in two different phases, August and November 2018, reissue sanctions that were suspended. And then since November 2018, the administration again decided to grow pressure on Iran. The driver of this entire process has been the Trump administration looking to use coercive diplomatic measures against Iran to make sure that Iran does not get a nuclear weapon and that Iran's other threats are dealt with. I think it would be a mistake to unfortunately try to ascribe it to some foreign power. Lastly, I think the caller mentioned something about food and medicine. Again, there are no sanctions on medicine. However, when it comes to food, it's interesting to note that the Europeans now, especially under the max pressure campaign, have been critical of the Trump administration because America is actually selling Iran more wheat now than before. So the U.S. agricultural industries are actually able to export wheat to Iran, much like the United States did during the Soviet Union, which I think that started under Jimmy Carter, to make sure that these coercive penalties that they have against an adversary don't impact the trade of food.
What is your interest in Iran?
Both personally and professionally. I'm an Iranian American, born and raised in the States. I think the Iran issue set is fascinating because it cuts across at so many issues. Iran and America were at once the best of friends. Now, unfortunately, they are enemies. And I think when you look at Iran today, it's a country with so much potential. And unlike the Middle East, most of the other countries in the Middle East, I should say, unlike them, the population isn't reflexively anti-American. The population isn't reflexively anti-Israel. The population isn't reflexively anti-Semitic. If anything, this is one of the few areas in the Middle East where our ideology as Americans and our values as Americans and our national security prerogative as Americans needn't be in conflict like they may be in other theaters. And really, when you look at Iran since 1979, it's the story of squandered potential. And I think anyone who's interested in great power politics or even Middle Eastern politics should look to the Iranian story as a cautionary tale for what can happen to a nation when the wrong leaders come about. And I think 1979 was more than 2 steps backward for that country.
Did your parents migrate from Iran, and why?
They did, but my father was out since the late 60s, early 70s, working as an antique carpet repairman in Milan, and my mother's family fled after her father, who was a journalist under the Shah for one of the 2 major state papers, was taken to Evin prison right after the revolution, and then they fled when he got out.
We'll go to Thomas in Elmira, New York, independent.
Yes, good morning. This guest is very impressive. I'm a U.S. Navy veteran of Operation Desert Storm, and he's absolutely correct for what he's doing.
Okay, in what way, Thomas? What are you referring to?
He's very intelligent. You have to understand what's going on the ground and what's going on the political level and the military level. You have to keep a very big picture look on what's going on in Iran and the Middle East as a whole right now and what needs to be done. And a maximum pressure campaign is the correct way to go.
Okay. Well, let's talk about Iran's involvement in Iraq. Is the U.S. in support of it or opposed? And what impact is Iran having on the political situation in Iraq?
You know, that's a great question, because since the Iran-Iraq War ended in 1988, this was an 8-year bloody conflict between 2 Middle Eastern adversaries. Again, a conflict that needn't have come about, but again, because of accidents and people thinking that they can one-up each other in the Middle East, this was an 8-year conflict that killed countless people on both sides. But since the end of that conflict, Iran was forever slated to intervene in the politics, the society, the military, the economics, and even the religious institutions in its next door neighbor, Iraq, to never again let this threat next door, conventionally or unconventionally, mount a challenge to Iran. So when you see high Iraqi oil exports, that's a challenge to Iran. When you see seminarians in the holy city of Najaf, which is really the epicenter of Shiism in the Middle East, occasionally challenge a fatwa or a religious ruling by Iran's supreme leader Khamenei, that's a challenge to Iran's ruling governing ideology. And when you see Iraqi nationalism and Iraqis who want a better Iraq, that's a challenge to Iran's security strategy in Iraq, because Iran is trying to create a Trojan horse in Iraq, to create militias that could eventually co-opt the state, much like the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in Iran was derived of actually popular militias and street committees and thugs that helped bring about the 1979 revolution. And they eventually became a check against Iran's national army. And today they are this force that is exporting Iran's revolution abroad through force. So in Iraq today, there is a competition for Baghdad between Washington and Tehran. I think it's going to get pretty challenging quite fast, because Iran's influence in the parliament is growing because of all these pro-Iran Shia militias that actually have seats there. And I think the longer we don't designate them, the longer we don't push back on them, the louder their voice may be. And there may come a time when Iran does something in Iraq and the U.S. would seek to respond, and the Iraqi government, because it's owned or controlled by agents or affiliates of Tehran, actually asked the U.S. to leave.
What do you make of this news this morning? This is from the Jerusalem Post. American officials confirm that Israel was behind strikes in Iraq. And this from a report that the New York Times reported that American officials have confirmed that Israel has been carrying out airstrikes against Iranian targets in Iraq. One senior official also expressed concerns that Israel is pushing the limits, and its operation could eventually lead to the U.S. withdrawing its troops from Iraq. So take on the strikes, but then also the outcome of that, U.S. withdrawing its troops from Iraq because of this. what will happen?
Well, I think that kind of gets into the nightmare scenario that we were talking about, where what happens if the democratically elected government in Baghdad asks the U.S. to leave? You know, the U.S. needs to be there not just for the counter-ISIS coalition, but I think a presence on the ground can tell Iraqis who don't want to be owned or controlled by Iran that you have an alternative, that you have a different choice. So I think America should be in Iraq for the long game. Now, the Israeli strikes are actually quite fascinating because Israel has been the one doing the bulk of the military pushback against Iran in the region, chiefly in Syria. You know, for the past 2 years, I think you've seen Israelis become more comfortable reporting that, oh, it is, you know, here are the targets that the Israelis are hitting. You've seen journalists have more sources within Israel and within Syria talking about Israeli strikes, not just on missile depots, but on military bases, on installations that Iran owns or controls in Syria, and even installations that Iranians and Syrians operate in together in Syria. But people had thought that that would be geographically contained to Syria, and I would actually say I was one of those because of the operational range the Israeli Air Force would have to go, and of course the challenge of would this get the U.S. involved somehow if Israel is striking in a theater where America is in a particularly precocious and politically sensitive spot in. And the fact that there have been 3 or 4 explosions of Shia militia depots where they store weapons in a staging ground before they move them over this thing called a land bridge from Iraq into Syria does present, I think, something of a challenge. On the one hand, I think anyone who wants to push back against Iran in the region should be happy that these depots are being targeted. Conversely, I think navigating the politics of Iraq versus navigating the non-governance of Syria is going to be a challenge for Washington.
Barbara in Tennessee, Democratic caller, you're next.
Good morning. My question is for the gentleman. All the things that the United States have been involved in with Israel or Saudi Arabia, all the bombings, things that are going on over in the Middle East, is there any thought about the United States reaping all the stuff that we are sowing in the world, all this, you know, bombing and killings? Do they ever realize that it might come over to the United States, especially with Russia moving in right into Kentucky, you know, different places? That's my question.
Well, just to kind of start at the end there, with Russia moving in, I would say in the Middle East, Russia is a highly opportunistic actor. In areas where the U.S. does leave a vacuum in a military, diplomatic, or economic sense, you've seen Russian forces move in, not just in Syria militarily, but through arms sales in places like the Arab states of the Persian Gulf or even Egypt. Whenever there's an ability for the Russians to exploit the U.S. non-commitment to this region, the Russians increasingly under Putin have shown a willingness to do so. But in terms of reaping what we sow, I think that there's been certain periods of time, the 1990s is one of them, where if the U.S. kind of buries its head in the sand, thinks this is the end of history, and that shows a disinterest in the Middle East, that things will be okay. That in fact we can push away from the table and that the region itself wants nothing to do with us and that there are no American interests at stake. I would say the opposite. And I would say that, you know, one of the things that can keep the homeland safe is a sustained presence in the region, working with and through local partners in the region, and remembering that America does a lot of good for this region. Look back in the history of American missionaries, look back in the history of early American diplomatic facilities in the region. I'm talking 1904, 1905 to present. As well as look at what the U.S. is doing most recently through its military in the region. It's by invitation of some of the Arab states of the Persian Gulf that the U.S. posture is there to deter Iran. Look what the U.S. has done against ISIS in places like Iraq and Syria. I think those are places where a judicious application of American military force has done a lot. We'll
go to Greg, Short Hills, New Jersey, Republican.
Yeah, hi, good morning.
Morning.
I mean, there's just so much on the plate here, but I just wanted to say, I wanted to ask, what on Mike Pompeo's laundry list of activities by Iran was initiated by Iran sua sponte, in the sense that it was not in direct response to the fact that we pulled out of the nuclear deal, okay, or other actions by either our so-called ally Israel or ourselves in the region. Okay, that was one thing. Name me one thing on that list that was not a legitimate response by Iran to activities by the United States or Israel. And secondly, please explain to the world why Iran is routinely referred to as the greatest exporter of terrorism in the world. And if that's the case, okay, then please explain the difference between the Sunni regimes like Saudi Arabia and the Shia regime like Iran, okay, and what terror organizations are associated with the Sunni regime versus what terror organizations are associated with the Iranian regime, okay, and what the purpose of Hezbollah has been in southern Lebanon, the existence of Hezbollah supported by Iran has been, what is the purpose of Hezbollah in southern Lebanon? Okay.
Okay, Greg, Mr. Taleblu, taking notes here.
Yes, that required about half a page. Very, very interesting comments. I think I can put them into a couple of buckets. The first is what I think on the Secretary's list is Iran doing that is not a response to the May 8, 2018 withdrawal of the U.S. from the JCPOA nuclear deal, if I got that correctly. So on May 21st or May 20th, 2018, the Secretary gave a speech right near here at the Heritage Institute, Heritage Foundation, laying out 12 points for what end states would be for a new deal with Iran. And you can put those points into buckets. There's, the nuclear threat, the missile threat, the regional/terrorism threat, and then of course there's one other point about hostages that are still detained in Iran. Almost all those things, almost all those challenges are challenges that the Islamic Republic has posed not just to U.S. interests and security and not just to allied interests and security, but to international interests and security really since 1979. For instance, there's the notion, the one point on hostages and hostage taking. The Islamic Republic of Iran kind of birthed itself in 1979 through an act of hostage taking. I'm sure we all remember the November 4, 1979 storming of the U.S. Embassy. For instance, terrorism. Iran has routinely supported a wide array of terror groups throughout the region, really since 1979, 1980, whether it's trying to sell arms to Shia, pass arms to Shia militias in Bahrain, use organizations in Iraq at that time, like Badr, against the regime in Iraq. There is unfortunately a long history here. Ballistic missiles is another issue that's on the Secretary's agenda. It was during the Iran-Iraq War that, some could even say for legitimate defensive reasons, Iran went to Syria, Libya, and North Korea to procure Scud missiles to respond in kind to Saddam Hussein's use of missiles. But now that one tool that was trying to keep Iran safe during the 1980-1988 Iran-Iraq War is actually what is driving more conflict and more instability when you see the Houthi rebels in Yemen using ballistic missiles that can fly over 1,000 kilometers to strike military and civilian targets alike. So the proliferation of these weapons is a problem and are things that have been long-standing in the region and not new to the Iranian desire to respond to the U.S. withdrawal from the nuclear deal. Two last points. I think you mentioned Hezbollah. Hezbollah, many analysts, whether you're pro-deal, anti-deal, or have no view on the nuclear deal, many can agree that this is the most successful export of Iran's Islamic Revolution, and I would be one of those who would agree with that statement. In 1982, Iran basically created Lebanese Hezbollah in Lebanon. What it's doing across the region now is an attempt to replicate that model where you have a militia that operates separately from the state, give it military power, financial power, and then increasingly political power. That entity is really designed to not just co-opt the Lebanese state, which is weak, but to pose a conventional threat to Israel, to put basically a knife to the neck of Israel so that the Iranian homeland can be safe and make Israel fight a defensive war all the way on its border, as opposed to being able to engage in an offensive war further away from its border. And then lastly, I think the caller mentioned Sunni terrorism versus Shia terrorism. This is one area where I think U.S. foreign policy should not discriminate. Terrorism is terrorism. The U.S. needs to combat terrorism and violent extremism wherever it finds it, not just lone wolf online radicalization, but actually states that support it. The difference, of course, if I may insinuate based on what the caller was saying, is Saudi Arabia versus Iran. Saudi Arabia, while there are lots of charities that spring out of Saudi Arabia, lots of radical preachers that we have issues with in Saudi Arabia, as a measure of state policy, the Saudi state is pro-U.S. and pro-status quo, and the Iranian state, or the government of the Islamic Republic of Iran, is anti-status quo and anti-U.S. and has used terrorism as an instrument of national security policy, not just in sectarian ways, but in some very lethal ways. The different groups, of course, briefly, things that could fall under the umbrella of Sunni jihadism, Sunni terrorism, Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, the Taliban, things that could fall under the umbrella of Shia terrorism, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, its associated Quds Force, Lebanese Hezbollah, and a wide array of Iraqi Shia militias.
We'll go to Daniel next in Colorado, independent, our last. Go ahead, Daniel.
It seems to me with the change in the last 50 years, it's much easier to have a world economic war than a world military war. And I try to keep things simple in that regard, but I don't see that we have any choice but to start a worldwide economic war to get the changes that we need.
Okay, and Daniel, I have to leave it there because we're short on time, but take his thought there, a world economic war versus a world military war.
Well, that's an interesting point because the U.S. doesn't really want any kind of war. These are responses to the sustained challenges that the Islamic Republic has posed again to U.S. interests and security for the past 40 years. And it's not just American interest and security at stake. The U.S., if we're going to talk about an economic war, if we're going to talk about economic measures, has felt increasingly comfortable using coercive and punitive economic measures like sanctions, like designations, and relying on the strength of the U.S. dollar and relying on the fact that foreign financial institutions still need to clear transactions through through New York, to make sure that there is this power behind something other than just bombs. There is a power behind the U.S. currency. There is a power behind transactions. And using that power, Washington has been able to achieve some pretty strong national security ends without actually having to fire a single bullet. And I think we're in an era in the post-9/11 world where covertly there's a bipartisan interest and a nonpartisan capability in the use of cyber, and overtly a bipartisan interest and a nonpartisan capability in the development of economic sanctions. And I think we're moving towards a world where people don't want conventional conflict and people don't want to do nothing about a national security crisis. And these two tools, cyber and sanctions, are going to play an increasingly important role in the U.S. national security toolkit.
To follow Behnam Ben Taleblu's work, you can go to fdd.org. They're also on Twitter @FDD, senior fellow there for the foundation.